Last week, we explored NVIDIA's DLSS 4 super resolution upscaling in detail for 4K gaming, finding that DLSS 4 is quite a significant upgrade over DLSS 3. The updated technology, featuring a new Transformer AI model, removes much of the TAA blur that's plagued modern gaming over the last decade. It improves stability in motion, and it better resolves fine details like meshes, grates, and grass. Ultimately, we found that using DLSS 4 on the performance mode is the new acceptable minimum, as it now provides an image with enough stability for 4K gaming. But is that also true for 1440p gaming? Historically, upscaling has been worse at a lower output resolution, often struggling to handle the lower render resolutions that are given to the algorithm. Even using DLSS 3 on the quality mode at 1440p can lead to noticeable issues, while that mode is often quite okay at 4K. Does DLSS 4 finally open the door to lower upscaling modes like balanced or performance while retaining reasonable visual quality? Well, let's find out. Similar to the 4K investigation, in this video I'll be exploring image quality across 14 different areas, including texture quality, edge stability, ghosting, disocclusion, foliage, particles, water, and more. After matching up and comparing footage in all the areas upscaling tends to struggle, we'll have a really solid idea what DLSS 4 modes are visually equivalent to DLSS 3, and how much improvement NVIDIA has been able to deliver. We'll also look at performance later. This video is not going to go through quite as many examples as the 4K video because we recommend watching that video first, and we don't want to waste people's time with comparisons they've already seen. All of the visual examples in this video were captured at 1440p using a GeForce RTX 5090, though this video is 4K to ensure YouTube delivers it at the highest bitrate. I've used a selection of games, all of which had settings such as motion blur, grain, vignette, and chromatic aberration disabled. For the DLSS 3 examples, each game was upgraded to the final version of DLSS 3 Upscaling 3.8.10 using the utility DLSS Swapper. Then for DLSS 4, each game was upgraded to the latest model using NVIDIA's override feature available in the NVIDIA app. This allows us to compare the best version of DLSS 3 with the best version of DLSS 4 in every title. So let's get into it. One of the most impressive things we found about DLSS 4 at 4K was how it preserved texture quality in motion and practically eliminated the TAA blur that's been plaguing games for ages. I'm happy to report that this benefit also applies to DLSS 4 at 1440p. If you've been playing games at this resolution using native TAA, you'll notice that even the DLSS 4 performance mode produces less blur in motion, with a similar level of clarity regardless of whether you're stationary or in motion. Native TAA or DLSS 3 using DLAA in contrast both produce a blurrier image when you start moving relative to standing still. This means that in most examples we saw, the DLSS 4 performance mode delivers higher texture quality than DLSS 3 quality. It depends on the game we're looking at as to whether it matches native rendering or exceeds it, but generally the improvement is significant. Once again, this creates a presentation that appears like the game is being run at a higher resolution with higher quality texture packs. This is really what 1440p gaming should look like. DLSS 4 also exceeded my expectations significantly when looking at edge stability for 1440p gaming. This is really where DLSS has fallen apart previously, and even at times it has been difficult to recommend DLSS 3 quality mode because of it. For example, here in Black Myth Wukong, DLSS 3 quality has noticeable stability issues reconstructing this relatively slow-moving character, which you usually don't see as much of using DLSS 3 quality at 4K. But take a look at how the DLSS 4 performance mode at 1440p handles the same edge stability. It's much improved, and this is the performance mode we're talking about with the render resolution of just 720p. Similarly, in this Ratchet & Clank example, the DLSS 4 performance mode has noticeably better stability than DLSS 3 quality. Edges are less aliased in motion, and yeah, there are still some problems here and there, but it's quite a noticeable improvement in my opinion. This makes DLSS 4 performance look much closer to native TAA rendering, even beating it in some aspects, compared to what we saw from DLSS 3 quality versus native. The improvement from DLSS 3 performance to DLSS 4 performance is astronomical, even larger than the improvement we saw at 4K, because the DLSS 4 performance mode at 1440p previously delivered disgusting image quality. Even in the examples where we saw a less significant improvement to stability at 4K, DLSS 4 holds up really well at 1440p. Driving in Cyberpunk 2077 produces a more consistent image frame to frame, better texture quality, less blur, and it can do all of that using the performance mode. For gaming at 1440p, this is truly a transformative update in these areas. Ghosting at 1440p is pretty similar to what we observed at 4K. In some instances, DLSS 4 is better at handling ghosting than DLSS 3, such as in Cyberpunk 2077, where DLSS 4 reduces ghosting in the street lamps and the car's tailpipe. However, in other situations where ghosting is more severe, DLSS 4 tends to produce even worse ghosting than DLSS 3, like we're seeing in Forza Motorsport. What I found interesting is that in these situations where DLSS 4 handles ghosting worse than DLSS 3, at 1440p it seems to be even worse again than at 4K. In this exact same Forza example at 4K, I tended to find DLSS 4 was a little worse, but not substantially so. At 1440p, there are some situations throughout this run where DLSS 4 was much worse, including examples where the ghost trail goes from being one double image to multiple double images. With that said, across most examples I used in this video, ghosting is not a huge concern at 1440p using either version of DLSS. Disocclusion is also a similar situation to what we saw at 4K. There has been a regression in this area compared to DLSS 3, with DLSS 4 creating more artifacts around your character in third-person games. This was most noticeable in games like The Last of Us Part 1, when Joel's head moves, there's a bit more sizzling in the DLSS 4 image as disocclusion occurs, comparing DLSS 3 versus DLSS 4 at the quality mode. This is partly because the DLSS 3 image is blurrier overall, which better obscures these artifacts. In Black Myth Wukong, you'll also spot disocclusion artifacts for 1 or 2 frames after your character moves. The good news is that these artifacts aren't shown for very long, especially at higher frame rates, because just 1 or 2 frames is in the tens of milliseconds range. It's only really noticeable when there are large and consistent movements, like in the Last of Us example, where after a few tens of milliseconds, the old artifact is replaced with a new artifact. The bad news is that if you do spot this issue, it'll probably be worse in DLSS 4. I don't think this is the end of the world because, surprisingly, there isn't a huge difference in disocclusion between DLSS 4's quality and performance modes. Yes, the resolution of the disocclusion is a bit worse in the performance mode, but both have a similar type of artifact visible. I was thinking that maybe the performance mode would fall apart here, and yes, disocclusion is worse than DLSS 3's performance mode, but it's not a devastating impact. At 4K, we found no significant difference in hair quality between DLSS 3 and DLSS 4. This is also true at 1440p, where generally the same quality mode is a match in aliasing and shimmering, so quality versus quality or performance versus performance. I wouldn't say the performance mode here is awful, but hair quality is noticeably better using higher modes, especially the quality mode or even better native rendering. Fine detail like hair can get a bit lost when upscaling, so hopefully this is an area that can improve with future DLSS editions. Particle quality receives the same upgrades at 1440p as at 4K when using DLSS 4. That is to say, particle ghosting is reduced significantly at the same quality mode, as you can see from this Last of Us example. 1440p upscaling really doesn't look great using DLSS 3 quality in this test, whereas DLSS 4 quality is much less streaky, albeit with apparently fewer particles being resolved. I saw similar ghosting reductions in Starfield. The main difference to 4K is that while the resolution of particles does decrease at lower quality modes, I feel the performance is a bit too low here for resolving particle detail properly, even using DLSS 4. The quality of fast-moving particles is a bit pixelated and grainy using the performance mode, so ideally I wouldn't want to drop below balanced for this type of effect. With transparencies, I saw no real upgrade at 1440p between DLSS 4 and DLSS 3. This seems to be an effect that is highly sensitive to render resolution, so the most equivalent modes are quality versus quality, performance versus performance, and so on. This is similar to what we saw at 4K, but I believe at 1440p there are even fewer edge cases where a lower DLSS 4 mode can match a higher DLSS 3 mode. The only exception to this would be stationary transparencies, which are more detailed with DLSS 4. The issue with 1440p upscaling of transparencies is those lower modes can really expose the low render resolution compared to at 4K. The bounce mode is usually okay, but some edge cases are less than ideal. The performance mode really struggles to keep some types of transparencies stable. In this respect, there can be very little difference to DLSS 3 performance mode upscaling at 1440p, so for these sorts of effects I wouldn't drop below balanced. When it comes to fine detail reconstruction, DLSS at 1440p is a bit less effective than at 4K. At the higher resolution, I tended to find that DLSS 4 bounced was a match for DLSS 3 quality, and that can be true at 1440p as well, for example with this spire in Cyberpunk 2077 in motion. But it was more common to see a similar mode required for similar quality, such as with overhead power lines like in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Here I would say DLSS 4 quality is slightly better than DLSS 3 quality, so it is an upgrade if you're using the same mode, but if we drop DLSS 4 down to balanced, it's not quite as good as DLSS 3 quality. So I guess you could say there's about half a tier of quality improvement in this particular area. The other thing to be aware of is that there can be quite a bit of aliasing in these sorts of elements when using the DLSS 4 performance mode. While the performance mode is a huge upgrade in other areas of stability, these fine pixel level lines, details and wires can often be aliased to the point they are distracting, which is pretty typical for DLSS 3 as well. For my personal preferences, the minimum level I'd be satisfied with in a game is the balanced mode, which still has some aliasing, though it's usually not as severe. The quality of tree upscaling in DLSS 4 at 1440p is better than what we saw from DLSS 4 at 4K relative to DLSS 3. At this resolution, DLSS 3 actually has quite a few issues properly rendering trees in motion, often leading to lots of sizzling and aliasing on leaves and branches. In addition, there was usually a loss of detail associated with TAA blur. What this means is that for slower and more consistent motion, DLSS 4 performance at 1440p is actually capable of outperforming DLSS 3 quality, like you've been seeing in The Last of Us. In fact, in Indiana Jones, the level of stability and foliage quality on the trees is better in the DLSS 4 performance mode than using native 1440p rendering, either using TAA or DLSS 3 DLAA. That's a very impressive outcome that really cleans up one of the pain points to upscaling at 1440p. For faster motion like we see in Star Wars Outlaws with trees blowing in the wind, here it's trickier for DLSS 4 performance to match DLSS 3 quality. Like we saw at 4K, this is more of a like-for-like match between quality modes. In Black Myth Wukong, I tended to find in this tricky example that DLSS 4 balanced was close to DLSS 3 quality, and to be on the safe side, that's usually the matchup I'd say is typical for DLSS 4, though it varies a lot between games. And when comparing the performance modes, it's a night and day improvement. DLSS 3 performance looks very bad, and while DLSS 4 performance isn't amazing, the image flickers less, it's less aliased, and it isn't as garbage in motion. For grass quality, like at 4K, DLSS 3 can have issues with grass being grainy or blurry when upscaled at 1440p, which is somewhat improved using DLSS 4. However, I don't think DLSS 4 is as strong at this lower resolution, as I found fewer situations where DLSS 4 performance could match DLSS 3 quality. It is possible, especially when motion is slower and more consistent, but a more typical outcome is DLSS 4 balanced matching DLSS 3 quality with similar results to native rendering as seen in this Star Wars Outlaws example. Unfortunately, DLSS 4 performance mode is usually too grainy and pixelated to get a recommendation over the balanced mode, and it's here that fine grass detail can fall apart, especially with grass moving in the wind. At 4K, the performance mode was often fine for grass, but this is less true at 1440p in those really dense environments. Of course, DLSS 4 can be an upgrade over DLSS 3 when comparing the performance modes directly. I just don't think the resulting image quality is sufficient for high fidelity gaming. Fences, grates and fine meshes is another area where DLSS at 1440p tends to struggle more than at 4K. There are still some situations where the DLSS 4 performance mode is more stable and better able to resolve patterns than DLSS 3 quality, like in The Last of Us, but there are other examples like this one in Cyberpunk 2077 where DLSS 4 was not able to clean up the moire patterns seen in DLSS 3. DLSS 4 passed this test at 4K with flying colours, not so at 1440p. For finer mesh detail, like here in Cyberpunk, I tended to find that DLSS 4 balanced and DLSS 3 quality looked similar, though neither is as good as native rendering for this type of element. The biggest uplift was comparing the performance modes, where DLSS 3 looks disgusting and DLSS 4 looks okay. Though like with some of the previous tests, I don't think the performance mode is quite good enough at upscaling fences to be usable at 1440p, at least if you're looking for only a minor hit to visuals relative to native 1440p rendering. Cloth quality receives similar upgrades to what we saw at 4K, where flowing cloth can be better detailed on DLSS 4 performance mode compared to DLSS 3 quality, a byproduct of superior texture rendering and less blur. Moire patterns are also reduced on cloth in motion, though this improvement is less widespread than at 4K. At the higher resolution, DLSS 4 performance nearly eliminated moire patterns on cloth, whereas at 1440p the upgrade to DLSS 4 merely reduces moire patterns when comparing the performance mode to DLSS 3. They can still be visible at this quality mode. Typically, I found balanced was a good place to be, as cloth quality is decent at that preset and moire patterns are less visible, in some cases eliminated. At 1440p I didn't see much difference in water quality comparing DLSS 3 and 4, generally the same quality modes deliver the same sort of visual experience. When using the performance mode at 1440p, water can be a bit aliased and blurry depending on the implementation, so this is another area where you'd probably want to stick to balanced at a minimum. Lastly, we have rain. How this effect is upscaled at 1440p is very similar to what we saw at 4K. When it comes to the rain particles themselves, there's little difference between DLSS 3 and DLSS 4. For example, here in Ratchet & Clank, I was only able to match raindrop detail with the same mode, so quality versus quality. Then for the stability of the image behind the rain, DLSS 4 Balanced is a close match for DLSS 3 Quality, so at best, we're seeing a 1 quality step improvement. Okay, let's take a look at performance. Last time I used the GeForce RTX 5080 at 4K, this time I'm using the GeForce RTX 4070 Super at 1440p. In Starfield, we see a single tier loss of performance moving from DLSS 3 to DLSS 4, so the performance we used to get at DLSS 3 Quality is now only achievable using DLSS 4 Balanced. Comparing the same modes, DLSS 4 was 5% slower. In Dragon Age the Veilguard, I also saw about a single tier loss of performance, so DLSS 4 Balanced is equivalent to DLSS 3 Quality in frame rate. This meant DLSS 4 ran 8% slower. In Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, I reported less of a performance hit, just 1% for the quality mode and 4% using Balanced. This means we saw less than half a tier of performance loss, and DLSS 4 Balanced is still faster than DLSS 3 Quality. In Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, slightly more than 1 tier of performance hit, meaning DLSS 4 Balanced and DLSS 3 Quality are again a close match. DLSS 4 ran 7% slower at the same quality settings. In Black Myth Wukong, it's about a half tier of performance impact, so DLSS 4 Balanced sits between DLSS 3 Quality and Balanced. Comparing the same modes was a 5% loss to frame rate. Lastly, we have Cyberpunk 2077, which as we showed at 4K is one of the better performing DLSS 4 titles, seeing only a small 3% hit to FPS moving from DLSS 3 to 4 at the quality mode, and 6% using the Balanced mode. This results in a bit less than half a tier of performance impact. In summary, using a geomean of the 6 games tested, DLSS 4 ran 5% slower than DLSS 3 using each of the 4 modes tested, at least in this configuration. I expect this to also be roughly true for other 40 and 50 series GPUs, with a slightly larger impact on the 30 series and a bigger impact again on the 20 series. Hopefully we'll be able to investigate that further in a future video. What this means is there is about half a tier of performance impact moving from DLSS 3 to 4. DLSS 4's Balanced mode sits between the DLSS 3 Quality and Balanced mode in FPS performance on average, a little faster than Quality, but not as performant as the old Balanced mode. Not too much difference to what we saw at 4K. This meant that the DLSS Quality mode went from a 41% increase over native TAA to a 34% increase, but if you switch to DLSS 4 Balanced, you get a 45% increase. Like we saw analysing DLSS 4 for 4K gaming, this new version of DLSS upscaling is also very impressive for 1440p gaming. Nvidia has once again been able to deliver noticeably higher image quality at each tier in the majority of scenarios we tested. This either makes DLSS now genuinely viable for 1440p gaming without a significant loss to visual quality, or it opens the door for lower modes like DLSS Balanced to deliver playable and acceptable image quality. The problem with upscaling at 1440p is that up until now, it's always been a bit dicey as to whether the visual quality impact from upscaling was acceptable, even using the quality mode. There have been games where DLSS quality mode has been perfectly fine, but there have also been examples where enabling upscaling at 1440p leads to a less stable, blurrier presentation. While upscaling tends to shine at 4K, it's much more difficult to upscale from the lower render resolutions that a 1440p output demands. Some games have also suffered from pretty poor native 1440p image quality too, thanks to issues with TAA blur and poor implementations for this resolution. DLSS 4 is the improvement that 1440p gaming has desperately needed for years. This is a very popular resolution for modern PC gaming, so I was pleased to see significant improvements to image quality using DLSS 4 in areas like blur, textures, stability, grass, and trees. Quality mode upscaling looks really good now, much better than previous versions of DLSS, to the point where upscaling should now be viable in the vast majority of games with either minimal quality loss relative to native TAA, or even improved image quality when the TAA implementation is bad. On top of this, I believe the DLSS 4 Balanced mode has improved to the point where it's now equivalent to the DLSS 3 Quality mode in general at 1440p, and in some cases provides better visual quality. Balanced is the new acceptable minimum for 1440p gaming, shuffling down one tier relative to DLSS 3, and I was really happy with how this mode looks after hours of gaming. The performance mode is still a little too unstable and garbled in some key areas for me to recommend at 1440p, though the improvement from DLSS 3 performance to DLSS 4 performance is huge. The specific areas where DLSS 4 is improved at 1440p are similar to at 4K, so the majority of the gains come from reduced blur and improved stability. As we saw in the previous video, there are no substantial gains made to hair rendering or water quality, and there's even a regression in disocclusion. Some aspects have improved more at 1440p, like tree rendering, while others have not improved as much, such as transparency and fence rendering. If I had to summarize the improvement that DLSS 4 has achieved at 1440p, it's probably one tier of quality improvement at a half tier of performance cost. But I'm not sure this tells the full story. At 4K, the gap between native and DLSS 3 quality upscaling wasn't that large, often making quality upscaling a great way to increase performance for free. At 1440p, the gap between native and quality upscaling is larger in a lot of games, and the visual cost is more noticeable. In some instances, the upgrade is less about a tier shift and more about reducing the visual cost of 1440p upscaling in general. Situations where previously upscaling wasn't good enough, now DLSS 4 balanced might be good enough, and that's an amazing improvement in my opinion. It's also good news for gamers in general, because games are continuing to get more demanding on GPU hardware. That normally wouldn't be an issue with sufficient advancements in mid-range products. Gamers would just upgrade to the next great affordable GPU. Except great affordable GPUs are just not a thing anymore. So developers faced with insufficient mainstream GPU performance are relying more on upscaling as a crutch. The result is that a lot of 1440p gamers need to use upscaling for acceptable performance, and luckily DLSS 4 is a lot better in that area. As for AMD and their FSR tech, again, we'll be able to explore FSR 4 shortly, so it's not worth providing a full breakdown on how DLSS 4 and FSR 3.1 compare. But there's an even bigger mountain for AMD to climb at 1440p than there is at 4K. They are further behind at this resolution, and it's a more common resolution, so FSR 4 needs to be a staggering upgrade to catch up. Needless to say, 1440p gaming will be a huge focus of our FSR 4 analysis, because in a lot of instances, the quality FSR 3.1 provides is just unacceptable. Until FSR 4 proves itself, DLSS 4 is categorically the best way to play games at 1440p. So that does it for our investigation into DLSS 4 versus DLSS 3 at 1440p. Make sure to check out the 4K analysis as well, as it's got a lot more detail in the differences between the two technologies. The next step for us will be analyzing FSR 4. You should see that on the channel not too far away from now, as soon as the embargoes lift for all the RDNA 4 stuff that we're expecting to be announced shortly. So yeah, we'll be leaving some of the stuff like 1080p for more of a DLSS 4 versus FSR 4 sort of analysis. So we'll get to that eventually, but yeah, next up, FSR 4, so pretty keen to check that one out. If you do want to support the channel and the independent testing and analysis that we do here at Hardware Unboxed, please consider supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, Discord chat, monthly live streams, BTS content, plenty of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.